Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the earliest crimes. But before we talk crime, we must talk coloring. This is the Honeybee Stamps Beach Please stamp set. It was drawn by Don Wolstagel, and I will be coloring the little image with the chairs and the palm trees. We're using Copic markers on Neenah 80-pound cardstock. We're using a couple of other die sets and some gem stickers to create a card. And yeah, so there's the coloring part. So let's go ahead and jump into our journey. Our journey today actually takes us to New Mexico, the territory of Texas, which included parts of what became New Mexico and Arizona, was annexed by the United States, and that was egregious to the country of Mexico because Mexico also claimed ownership of Texas. The bold annexation by the United States was all that was needed to declare war, and the Mexican-American War was born. It was fought between 1946 and 1948, and it ended with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and this treaty opened the door for both Arizona and New Mexico to become states. So after some border negotiations with Arizona and Texas, New Mexico became the 47th state admitted to the Union when President William Taft signed the New Mexico Statehood Bill on January 6, 1912. Some things you might not know about New Mexico. The whole enchilada fiesta in Las Cruces holds the record for the largest enchilada, the world's largest enchilada. Dancing while wearing your sombrero is illegal in New Mexico. Smokey the Bear was invented in New Mexico after the Captain Gap Fire of 1950, which burned 17,000 acres of land. Even though Pluto was no longer considered a planet, its discoverer was a New Mexican man named Clyde Tombaugh, T-O-M-B-A-U-G-H. I still claim that Pluto's a planet. I'm just saying. The Santa Fe staple of restaurant Tia Sophia's claims to be the first to have invented a breakfast burrito. They've had it on their menu since 1975. Albuquerque is home to more than 300 local hot air balloons, making it the hot air balloon capital of America with more than any other city. And sopapilla, that soft, pillowy goodness of yumminess, was first devoured in Albuquerque as many as 200 years ago. And also, New Mexico is home to a cold case murder dating back to the 1890s. So the first person we're going to meet is Mariana Contreras Perez. Mariana was born on March 1st, 1850 in Chihuahua, Mexico, and was the daughter of Antonio Perez and Maria de Jesus Contreras. And Mariana was the third of their three children and the only girl of the family. And with very little else found about her young life, we're going to move on and meet Albert. Now, Albert Fountain was born on Staten Island, New York on October 23, 1838, to Solomon Jennings and Catherine de la Fonte Jennings. He was third of their six children, 3 boys and 3 girls, and Solomon worked as a sea captain. Albert was educated in the state's public schools and then attended college at Columbia. After graduating, he moved to California, and when he got to California, he took Jennings on as a middle name and used his mom's Fontaine last name, but changed it to Fountain, so he dropped that E. He anglicized his mom's maiden name and became known as Albert Fountain. So in California, he found a job as a reporter with the Sacramento Union, and being a reporter may have been what caused the name change. Who knows? His job as a reporter sent him to Nicaragua to cover William Walker's expedition. And when he returned to California, he enrolled in law school and studied in Sacramento and passed the bar in 1860. Now, in 1861, the American Civil War began, and Albert enlisted for 3 years. He enlisted as a corporal there in Sacramento, and he was mustered into Echo Company of the 1st California Infantry at Camp Union. And that was the middle of September of 1861. He was promoted from corporal to sergeant and then appointed as first sergeant. So he was rapidly being promoted. So by March of 1862, he was a first sergeant. After he was promoted to first sergeant, he was then sent to Mesilla, New Mexico, where he met and married Mariana. And they were married on October 26, 1862. And sometime after their marriage, about 6-ish months or so, they were sent to Fort Craig. And in May of 1863, he accepted a commission as a second lieutenant, where he was then restationed in Company G in the same regiment in Franklin, Texas. And that was in May 11th, so a week or so after his promotion. So Albert's Find a Grave had a wonderful tribute to his military service. He received promotions and accommodations. There was even a side note that led me to believe he'd been injured at one point. He was even temporarily posted as a company commander while the company commander was recovering from an injury. But eventually, about 1865, Albert left the military and settled down with his family. Now, Albert and Mariana would eventually have 9 children, 5 boys and 4 girls. Their youngest was a boy named Henry, and he was born in 1887, about 12 years. Sorry, that's more than 12 years. About 20 years after Albert left the military. Now, Albert and Mariana moved their family to Franklin, Texas, and he set up a law practice and began a second public service career. He served as a county surveyor and a U.S. Customs collector. At this point in time after the Civil War, part of his job as a U.S. Customs collector would have been the redistribution of confiscated Confederate things, not land per se, but tangible things, money, gold, things that could be confiscated and redistributed or taxed for the federal government. He was also heavily involved in politics. He was a staunch Republican. He absolutely opposed slavery. And he attended the convention at Corpus Christi in 1886 and was elected vice chairman of the Republican convention. He actually campaigned and won his election for a Texas senator and went on to become the president of the Senate. His politics gave him many enemies, though, in Western Texas. And following an ugly confrontation with a man named Frank Williams in a saloon, Albert killed him in a duel. Still legal then. Okay. His tenure in legislation included his proposal to extend suffrage to women, the right to vote. He wanted women to have the right to vote. He was defeated. He also had wanted Franklin, Texas to be incorporated as part of El Paso, and that actually succeeded. However, his political fortunes seemed to kind of dry up as Franklin became part of El Paso, and it kind of sounded like, as I was reading, that his political and enemies were getting more and more traction against him. So he and Mariana moved their family back to Mesilla, New Mexico, and that was in about 1873. And they still have children. In fact, their youngest child wasn't born for another few years still. So after resettling in New Mexico, Albert went back to what he knew. He continued to pursue Republican politics and was elected to the New Mexico House of Representatives, and one time serving as Speaker of the House. He also, again, put on a military uniform. In 1879, he entered the military as captain of the Mesilla Scouts. It's kind of like the current equivalent to like a National Guard. And he actually ended that as a lieutenant colonel. He returned to the newspaper business and was a publisher of the Mesilla Independent newspaper. I think it said he also owned the paper. And he once again returned he hung his shingle, so to speak, as a lawyer. And he was good. He was very good. He spent his legal career in New Mexico defending mostly the good guys, but he did have a couple of occasional outlaws and cattle thieves among his clientele. One very famous outlaw was Billy the Kid. This was his most infamous loss as an attorney. And we know that Billy the Kid was convicted and he was sentenced to hang and escaped. And, we talked about Billy the Kid. We know his story. Working as a lawyer meant that Albert made friends, but it also meant that he made enemies. And most of his enemies were public, and they were ugly. It just got ugly. Politics were ugly then. Politics are ugly now. New Mexico was still a territory at the turn of the 19th century, and it was very wild still. Governor Sheldon actually appointed Albert to head a volunteer task force against gang activity in the southern area of New Mexico. And by gang, I mean cattle rustlers and cattle thieves. And Albert was good at his job. He took down the Kinney gang. He took down the Farmington gang. He was really good at dismantling these gangs of cattle rustlers. He also served or ran for election and won and served as a U.S. district attorney. And he targeted, as the district attorney, people committing land fraud. Land fraud disputes were common, and his influence in this particular area was unpopular. And it meant now that Albert had gone from making regular political enemies to entering the cutthroat realm of territorial politics. When Albert ran for U.S. District Attorney, his opposition was a newcomer named A.B. Fall. His name is also Albert, but we're just going to call him A.B. for the sake of confusion. And Albert won, and that made A.B. his nemesis. And the feud that these two men had for each other was public and not a secret to anybody. In the middle of this ongoing feud with A.B., Albert and he were opposing counsel in a lawsuit that included unlawful cattle branding. A.B. was the attorney for three men involved in the case: Oliver Lee, William McNew, and James Gillian. The three men found themselves being prosecuted by Albert because they were infringing on the operations of large-scale ranchers in the area. As a district attorney, Albert was a lawyer filing the suit. Brand stealing was a method of cattle rustling that was costing some of the large ranchers some serious money. And Albert was continuing his self-imposed and he was selected by the governor, mission to rid the New Mexico area of cattle rustlers. So there is a book written by A.M. Gibson called The Life and Death of Colonel Albert Jennings Fountain, and it talks about Albert's desire to make the frontier a more lawful place to live, and it talks about the rest of our story. So in order to prosecute these men for unlawful branding, Albert actually had to go to Lincoln County, which was the county seat, and file the suit in the county courthouse. So he traveled from Las Cruces, where him and his family were currently residing. It was about 150 miles, and it was not going to be the safest 150-mile trip. At his wife's behest, he took his 8-year-old son Henry along for the ride. It was reported that Maria had the idea for Albert to take Henry with him because no one would be evil enough to harm a child. She kind of hoped that Henry would be his safety pin, right? So once he arrived in Lincoln, the charges were filed, and Albert presented to the grand jury a case full of evidence. It included depositions, letters, affidavits, and brand registrations, which, that's all they needed, right? It was a huge grand jury process. It was reported that all through the court proceedings, Albert mentioned having a feeling of being closely watched, like in the courtroom, on the streets of Lincoln, and in the hotel lobbies at the end of the night as he visited with friends. Now, during a recess on the final day of the court, the trial, an anonymous messenger handed him a crudely written note, and it warned, quote, "If you drop this, we will be your friends. If you go on with it, you will never reach home alive," end quote. Albert did not let the threat of violence deter him. He was used to coming out prevailing in his cases, at least most of them. And this one was no different. He felt like he was on the right side of the law. And he was, in fact, victorious when the jury handed down 32 indictments against the three men named in the suit. Now, with the case over, Albert and Henry prepared to head home. It was in the afternoon of January 30th. Albert loaded the buckboard wagon and started for home with Henry at his side. So the buckboard wagon, I think it had like the picture I saw was a picture not necessarily of his wagon, but that style of wagon. It had more like a carriage, but not a covered wagon, but not an open wagon. So anyway, they headed for home. And the first leg of the trip was to go up into the Sacramento Mountains through the Ponderosa Pine area, and then they stopped for the night near the village of Mescalero. And while they were there, an Apache friend gave him a little pinto pony. So the next day, they tied the pony to the back of the wagon, and they headed down the mountains toward the desert floor. At Tularosa, at the foot of the mountain, they turned south and went around the west side of the mountain, heading for the little hamlet of La Luz to spend the night. Now, Albert stopped briefly with some friends to visit along the way, and he mentioned to the friends that he had noticed in his journeys that two riders, sometimes ahead of him, sometimes behind of him, seemed to always be there, but they were never close enough to be recognized. And he mentioned that he was feeling a little apprehensive about this journey, especially given the line from the note about not reaching home alive. So in La Luz, Henry came down with a bad cold, and Albert was feeling a little bit bad for him. So he gave him a quarter to go into the store to buy some candy, some sweets. Henry only spent 10 of those 25 cents, and he took the change, a nickel and a dime, and he tied it up in the corner of his handkerchief and stuck it in a pocket. Now, the next day is February 1st. Albert and Henry load up in the wagon with the pony in tow, and they head out across the Tularosa Basin, past White Sands, and they're headed home from Mesilla. They passed a stagecoach driver named Santos Alvarado, and he mentioned having seen 3 riders back up on the road. And he also mentioned to Albert that they stayed too far away to be recognized. Eventually, Albert saw the riders, and this time he noticed one was on a white horse. Now, I don't know the significance of that, but it must have meant something to Albert because he mentioned it. After stopping for a rest at a midway stop, Albert pressed on, and he came across another stagecoach. Was being driven by a man named Saturnino Varela. And both men commented on having seen these 3 riders kind of hanging around in the distance. The stagecoach driver, Santorino, suggested that Albert go back to the midway stop, spend the night, and then finish his journey the next day in the company of a stagecoach. The idea being that there's safety in numbers. Albert said no. He was worried about Henry, who was getting sicker and who needed care. And let's face it, 8-year-old boys need their mama when they're sick. He was also very aware that his wife already expected him home. He was running behind. And he again thought that nobody would be evil enough to attack his child, right? So he headed out across the rise called Chalk Hill. And the sun was falling and the cold wind was increasing. Albert probably wrapped up Henry in a blanket. He probably buttoned up his big heavy overcoat, and you know that he was looking for these men on horses. His uneasiness was probably increasing, and he most likely picked up his Winchester rifle that he was known to carry. I'm sure he kept it close, if not in his arms at all time. And what happened next is still a mystery. We don't know what happened next, except that somebody was in fact evil enough to attack a child. The next morning, Saturnino Varela, the stagecoach driver, on his return trip, discovered tracks of Albert's wagon. But it wasn't like the tracks were there, but the wagon wasn't. He also saw hoof prints of horses that did not belong. They were different from the hoof prints around the wagon, right? And they were not there. They didn't belong, I guess, is what kind of piqued his curiosity. But he saw no sign of the horse, the carriage, Albert, or Henry. So he ran, and by ran I mean he rode his horse through the San Augustine Pass and headed down into Mesilla to alert the family. So 2 search parties were sent out. One of them was led by Albert's son, and they rushed through the dark, cold night to the murder site, or the last place Albert was seen. And they were helped by 2 Apache scouts, and they were able to piece together some evidence. So as the sun began to rise, they found where a man had knelt and fired a gun from behind some shrubbery, and the shells and the casings were still on the ground. They discovered a site where 2 men had tended to 3 horses, And then they followed wagon tracks and discovered a pool of blood. One man discovered a blood-soaked handkerchief with a nickel and a dime tied carefully in its corner. They followed the wagon tracks of the buckboard and the hoof tracks of 6 horses east for 12 miles. That would be the 3 horses from the strange men, the 2 horses pulling the wagon, and the pony. They went west into a small, isolated mountain range called the Jarillas. I cannot pronounce that because words are hard. English is my first language, and I'm wearing braces. Harias Mountains. And when they were there, they found the carriage. It had been plundered. It had been abandoned. And they tried to follow the track of the killers, and one trail led them toward one of Oliver Lee's ranches. And when the search party got there, they did not receive a warm welcome. In the days to come, new posses joined the search, hoping to find Albert and Henry, or at least find their remains. Rumors swirled through the desert and across the country. Newspapers covered the story in detail. The governor of New Mexico offered a reward for the capture of the killers, and most of the people in the area openly mourned Albert and Henry's presumed death. One local paper had a headline that read, quote, "The hour at hand, a devoted wife and loving family await longingly and hopefully the coming of a kind husband and father and a dutiful son and brother upon whose living faces they may never look again. Many friends hope against fate for the return of an honored friend, while many others search the plains for his living or dead body. If dead, there can be no question as to whose door the blame lies," end quote. Clearly, they're throwing shade. Without naming names, they're naming names. And A.B. Fall, now he was not only Albert's professional rival, he was a political opponent. As Albert was a Republican, A.B. was a Democrat, and A.B. claimed that at minimum, the newspaper article was inflammatory, that the Republican Party was using the Albert, quote, issue, that's what he called it, to crucify the Democrats. So the newspapers doing everything but naming names, and A.B. is saying, this is a political scam. Now, Albert's murder enraged the citizens of New Mexico, and it happened at the worst possible time. It was an election time, and the sheriff who had been running for a re-election was as crooked could be. And there were accusations against him and his friends of election fraud. I mean, the chaos was just everywhere. Governor William T. Thornton had to step in. He quickly took action. He worked to resolve the sheriff's contest by appointing Pat Garrett as the sheriff. So Pat had actually gained fame 15 years earlier as the man who apprehended and killed Billy the Kid. He had cleaned up a bad situation before, and the hope was that he could do it again. Governor Thornton also called on the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, and they assigned a professional investigator to assist Garrett. Now, the Pinkertons put an operative named John Fraser on the case, and John began his investigation undercover, eventually, outing himself as to who he was and investigating in open, and interviewed anybody with any knowledge of the case. John Fraser and Pat Garrett did not always get along, but they did manage to work together for this common goal, finding out who was responsible for the death of Albert, or the disappearance of Henry and Albert. The evidence really did point at 3 men. Former Deputy Sheriff William McNew, James Gilliland, and Oliver Lee. The same men who had just been indicted on 32 counts of brand fraud. The problem was that A.B. Fall, their lawyer, and their friend, was also a former judge and a politician. And people even claimed that A.B. was the mastermind behind the plot to kill Albert because of their long-standing feud. Now, Pat Garrett, that sounded like I said carrot, I meant Garrett, believed that he would never get a fair trial as long as A.B. was involved in the courts, as long as he was a judge. So he waited. Pat waited 2 years until the current political turmoil became history, and there was this new political landscape in New Mexico. And he brought all of his evidence to the court, and he secured indictments against all three men. Now, William McNew, the former deputy sheriff, was quickly arrested after the indictments were secured, but Oliver Lee and James Gillian, it's G, so however you want to say it, totally different story. So Oliver claimed that Pat only wanted a chance to kill him based on some past interaction they had, and he was using the murder as Albert as an excuse. So Oliver and James remained on the lam, right? Pat finally tracked them down on one of Oliver's ranches, and the outlaws actually got the best of the sheriff's posse in the ensuing gun battle. One of Pat's deputies was killed, and Pat and the two remaining deputies were forced to retreat. Oliver and James finally surrendered some months later under the condition that they would never be in the custody of Sheriff Pat Garrett. They were completely 100% using this he has it out for me kind of thing. They were brought to trial, okay, and the trial took place in a little tiny town called Hillsboro. But in Hillsboro, Albert and Henry were names on a paper. They weren't really people. But the defendants and AB, their attorney, they were known there. And it seems like they were liked there. Like this was their stomping grounds. So here we go to trial, right? All three of these men go to trial for the disappearance and murder of Henry and Albert Fountain. But at the trial, some of the witnesses went missing. Okay. They weren't there. They went missing. And the defendant's supporters who packed the courtroom intimidated everybody who was there. Witnesses, everybody who was there. It was, I can only imagine, it was like a version of the Jerry Springer show. The Jerry Springer show was a courtroom show, right? I mean, it was just a madhouse. And eventually, Oliver Lee, James Gillian, and William McNew were found not guilty. And they and their attorney, AB, was one of them, and their supporters, it was noted they celebrated all night long. Okay? All night long. The bodies of Albert Fountain and Henry Fountain are still unaccounted for. Theoretically, they were buried in an unmarked grave somewhere, and the location of that is still a mystery. Okay, this was 1896, so more than 100 years later. And there's still no indication of where Albert and Henry were put. All of the players involved in this story are long since gone, but it is still one of the oldest unsolved or unresolved cases in the history of New Mexico. I say unresolved because theoretically there was a trial and the men were found not guilty, but yeah, wow. I mean, you thought politics in the 2000s were ugly. Can you imagine if duels were still legal? How ugly that would be. Oh my gosh. And poor Mariana, she sends her husband out to do his job that he loves, knowing how dangerous it is. And she sends her youngest baby with him, her 8-year-old baby with him, just hoping that will ensure his safety. And oh my gosh, the turmoil that must have caused her as a mama, I can't even imagine. But there's a lot more to this case, the story that I did not tell. There's a lot more in the sources that I will link below, like always, about the politics that Albert was involved in, about his feud with A.B. Fall, about his mission to rid the Southwest of cattle rustlers and other criminals. Like there's a lot. Read the stories linked below. There's a lot more about his involvement in that. But can you imagine if politics were still, I mean, politics are ugly. Politics have always been ugly. But could you imagine how ugly they would get if you could still go out and have a duel with somebody? Oh my gosh, that would be awful. Okay, we're going to finish up and put this card together. I decided to pull out some of these honeybee stamps and gem stickers and add them on this little string of lights just to kind of zhuzh it up a little bit. The light bulbs were tiny and really hard to get any kind of dimension or they weren't the emphasis of the card, right? So I used one or two of every color. I didn't put one gem on every single light bulb on the card. I just added to the bigger ones because I thought it would make it look really super cute. And after we get all the gems on, we're going to zoom in a little bit so that you can see how that net die looks as a background on the card. Then we're going to zoom back in so you can see the gem stickers a little bit because why not? They look pretty. And I have pictures. Not just pictures of the card. I have pictures. I found a picture of Colonel Albert Jennings Fountain, Dasherman. A picture of his beautiful wife, Mariana, which coincidentally, I have a daughter named Mariana. And I have a picture of Henry in a little kilt, which I think is adorable. And just for kicks and giggles, I added a picture of Sheriff Pat Garrett. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I hope you enjoyed our story. It was kind of a little bit of a sad one. I have a couple of other videos here that I think you will like. I've also added that subscribe button. If you have not yet subscribed, I would love it if you did. Leave me a comment down below and tell me your thoughts about the story. Give me a thumbs up if you like the video and have a really great day.